The air in Briar Hollow was crisp, the kind of cold that settles deep into your bones and stays there long after you've closed your windows and locked your doors. October had always been a quiet month for the town, the streets growing emptier as night fell earlier and earlier. People would retire to their homes, draw the curtains, and settle into the familiar lull of routine. But lately, there had been whispers. Something was different this year. It started with the bells. At first, they thought it was a prank. Someone had to be sneaking into the old cemetery on the edge of town and playing tricks, ringing a bell at midnight. But as more and more people heard it, the joke began to lose its humor. No one could figure out where the sound was coming from. The town didn't have a bell tower or church with a working bell. And yet, every night at exactly 12, the chime would echo through the streets, hollow and distant. Old Mrs. Harper, the town's self-proclaimed historian, claimed it was a sign. The witching hour, she muttered to anyone who would listen. That's what it is. You young folk don't know what we used to hear, what we used to see. Things stir when that bell rings. Mark my words. People laughed her off, of course, as they always had. Briar Hollow was not a place for superstition. It was a sleepy little town, far from the chaos of the city, where life moved slowly, predictably. But then the bell kept ringing. That evening, Margaret Layton sat on her porch, knitting to pass the time as she always did when her husband worked late. She glanced at the sky, which had turned an inky black, thick with the promise of frost. In the distance, she could see the faint outlines of the trees surrounding Briar Hollow, their branches unmoving despite the slight wind. The silence was unnerving. Even the crickets had stopped singing. Then, it came. A single chime, low and mournful, like a church bell tolling for a funeral. It rang out once, twice. Margaret counted 6 times before the sound faded into nothing. She shivered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the sound had come from somewhere much closer than before. Somewhere in the heart of Briar Hollow. Margaret wasn't the only one who heard it. Across town, people woke in their beds, confused, checking their clocks. 12. Exactly 12. It had rung again, and with it, the air seemed to grow heavier, thicker, as if the entire town was holding its breath. The next day at the general store, the usual chatter was laced with unease. The bell had been louder, clearer. Even David Weller, who lived all the way on the outskirts of town, said it had woken him. "But that's impossible," he said to the group gathered near the counter. "There ain't a single bell for miles." Others chimed in, exchanging uneasy glances. They all knew the truth. There was no bell in Briar Hollow. There never had been. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows lengthened, the townspeople did something they hadn't done in years. They hurried home, drawing their curtains tight and locking their doors earlier than usual. As night descended, a tension gripped the town, like the entire place was waiting for something to happen. When midnight came, the bell tolled again. This time, it was louder, closer. Somewhere in the stillness, a dog howled. Then, all was quiet. And in that suffocating silence, something in Briar Hollow stirred. The next evening, an unnatural fog crept into Briar Hollow. It began slowly, just after sunset, when the last sliver of daylight vanished behind the hills. At first, it looked like an early autumn mist, rolling in from the woods beyond town, soft and harmless. But as it thickened, swallowing the streets and homes in its heavy gray, something about it felt wrong. By nightfall, the fog was dense and impenetrable, clinging to the ground like smoke. Street lamps flickered, casting halos of dim light that barely pierced through the murk. Even those who had lived in Briar Hollow their entire lives said they'd never seen fog like this, so thick it muffled sound, made distances hard to judge, and turned familiar landmarks into ghostly outlines. Margaret Layton stood at her window, staring out into the haze, unable to shake the growing sense of unease. The bell hadn't rung yet, but she could feel it coming. Every muscle in her body tensed, waiting for the now familiar chime to break the stillness. She glanced at the clock on the mantel. 11:58. From her vantage point, she could just make out the edge of the street below, where the fog curled around the porch steps like fingers reaching out from the ground. It moved strangely, twisting and shifting as though it had a mind of its own. And then she saw it. A shadow, darker than the mist, moving slowly through the fog. Her breath caught in her throat. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, but no. The shape was unmistakable. Something was out there. Something tall, human-shaped, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its gait uneven, like it was gliding more than walking. She stepped back from the window, heart pounding in her chest. Who? What was that? Across town, others were seeing it too. In every corner of Briar Hollow, people peered through their windows into the swirling mist, catching glimpses of dark figures moving just beyond the reach of their porch lights. No one dared to go outside. The town, usually so quiet at this hour, felt stifled, held in the grip of something unseen. Then, the bell rang. Margaret jumped, the sound cutting through the thick fog like a knife. It was louder than ever tonight, a deep, resonant chime that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The clock struck 12, and with each toll of the bell, the shadows in the fog seemed to grow bolder, more defined. Her mind raced. Were these the same shapes people had whispered about? The ones Mrs. Harper had warned them about, dismissing them as old wives' tales. As the bell rang its final note, the fog seemed to pulse, like something hidden within it had been waiting for this moment. Margaret's gaze was drawn back to the street below, where the dark figure stood still now, facing her house. She felt a chill creep down her spine as she realized it was watching her, or at least, it seemed to be. The fog clung to its form, obscuring any details, but she knew. It knew she was there. She stepped back, closing the curtain with trembling hands, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound of the bell faded, but the oppressive silence that followed was worse. What had she seen? A trick of the fog? A shadow of her imagination? But as she stood there, frozen in place, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in Briar Hollow. Something had crossed over into their world when the fog rolled in, and it wasn't going to leave. Across town, lights flickered out one by one, as homes were swallowed by the fog and the shadows within it. The people of Briar Hollow, already on edge from the mysterious bell, now found themselves trapped in a strange and shifting mist, haunted by shapes they didn't understand. No one slept that night, and when the sun finally rose, the fog was gone, vanished as quickly as it had come, leaving the town eerily still. But the fear remained, and so did the question. When the fog returned, would the shadows come with it? Somehow, deep down, everyone already knew the answer. The following night, Briar Hollow braced for the return of the fog, but it never came. Instead, something far more unsettling took its place. At exactly 3 a.m., the town fell silent, unnaturally silent. Clocks, radios, and even phones all stopped working at once, their screens flickering to black as if they had been drained of life. In homes across the town, people stirred, blinking in the darkness, trying to make sense of the sudden stillness. Margaret Layton woke with a start, her bedroom filled with the thick quiet that seemed to press down on her. She squinted at the clock beside her bed. 3:01, the red numbers frozen in place. Frowning, she got up and walked to the window, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet in the otherwise silent house. Outside, the world was strangely still. There was no movement, no sound, not even the whisper of wind. Margaret leaned closer to the window, peering into the night. The street below was empty, and though the familiar outlines of the trees and houses remained, there was something wrong, something off. The town seemed to hold its breath, as though it had slipped into another reality, one just out of sync with her own. She turned and flipped the light switch beside her bed, but nothing happened. The power was out, though the weather had been calm all evening. A gnawing unease settled in her chest as she glanced again at the clock. It still read 3:01. Time wasn't moving. Margaret's breath quickened. She opened her bedroom door and stepped into the hallway, feeling the strange weight of the silence pressing in around her. Downstairs, she could hear the faint sound of her husband snoring, oblivious to the eerie pause in time. But as she stood there, listening, the world outside the window seemed to shift, just slightly, like a ripple on the surface of a still pond. In homes all over Briar Hollow, the same unsettling stillness spread. People sat up in their beds, confused and disoriented, staring at frozen clocks and darkened windows. Some tried to turn on their televisions or phones, only to find static, blank screens, or dead batteries. The entire town was caught in a strange, breathless moment where time had ceased to exist. And then came the visions. Margaret blinked, rubbing her eyes as a flicker of movement caught her attention from the corner of her eye. Outside, the town had changed. The street she had lived on for years, so familiar, so mundane, was now unrecognizable. Shadows danced where they shouldn't, cast by streetlights that no longer glowed. The houses on either side of her seemed warped, their shapes distorted in the dim moonlight. And the air, thicker now, heavier, seemed to shimmer with a dark energy. She gasped as a figure appeared in the street. A person, but not a person she knew. Dressed in old-fashioned clothes, the figure walked slowly through the town, their face shrouded in shadow. Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth, heart racing. They weren't alone. More figures flickering in and out of view appeared on the street, their movements strange and erratic, like phantoms trapped in an endless loop. Each one seemed to drift through the darkened town, walking paths that no longer existed, houses that had long since been torn down. It wasn't just the town as it was now. It was a dark reflection of Briar Hollow, a place that shouldn't exist. For what felt like an eternity, the town remained frozen in that ghostly reflection as the people of Briar Hollow watched helplessly from their windows. Time stretched and twisted, an endless moment where the world had stopped, but something else had stepped in to take its place. And then, at exactly 4 a.m., the clocks ticked forward. With a sudden jolt, lights flickered back on, radios hummed to life, and the frozen town breathed again. The figures in the street vanished, dissolving into the first light of dawn, leaving behind only the lingering dread that something had been there, and it was still watching. Margaret stumbled back from the window, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to steady her breathing. The clock now read 4:01. Time had returned, but the memory of that lost hour clung to her like a shadow. She wasn't the only one. By morning, the town buzzed with rumors and whispers of the vanishing hour. People shared stories of the figures they had seen, the strange world that had replaced their own, and the terrible feeling that, Even though time had resumed, Briar Hollow was no longer safe. Something had shifted during that hour between 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock a.m. Something dark and ancient, stirring just beneath the surface of their reality. And they all knew deep down that it wasn't over. The strange happenings had turned Briar Hollow into a town of whispered conversations and anxious glances. Every night brought a new unease, each occurrence more inexplicable than the last. But what unnerved the townsfolk most wasn't the fog or the frozen hour. It was what was starting to surface. It began when old man Gregory found the well in his backyard uncovered. It had been sealed for years, ever since his grandfather had filled it in after some unfortunate accident decades ago. No one remembered exactly what had happened, only that the well had been boarded up and left to be forgotten. Yet when Gregory went outside that morning, the boards were gone, the earth disturbed, as though something had clawed its way back to the surface. He swore he hadn't touched it. And the strange thing was, he wasn't the only one. On the other side of town, just behind the library, another well was found exposed, its cover missing. The stones around it crumbled as if something had pressed its way out from below. A group of children, too curious for their own good, gathered around it, tossing small stones into the depths and listening for the echo. But the stones never made a sound, as if the well had no bottom at all. Margaret Layton, still shaken by the vanishing hour, heard the news from her neighbor and felt that familiar chill creep down her spine. First the bell, then the fog, then time itself had faltered. And now this? It was all connected, she was sure of it. But connected to what? That afternoon, she ventured to the town archives, hoping to find answers in the town's history. Mrs. Harper, the elderly librarian with a penchant for town legends, greeted her with a knowing smile. "You've come for the old stories, haven't you?" Mrs. Harper said, her voice soft but heavy with meaning. "About the wells and the tunnels?" Margaret blinked. "Tunnels?" Mrs. Harper nodded, motioning for Margaret to follow her deeper into the library. They passed rows of dusty shelves until they reached the back, where the older, forgotten records were kept. Mrs. Harper pulled out a heavy, leather-bound book, one Margaret had never seen before. It was worn, the pages yellowed with age. "Few people remember," Mrs. Harper continued, flipping through the pages, "but Briar Hollow wasn't always called that. Long ago, this land was home to a different kind of people who knew the power that slept beneath the earth." She stopped on a page showing an old map of the town, except it wasn't quite the town as it looked now. The streets were different, the buildings rearranged, but the wells, those were marked, and connecting them were faint lines, crisscrossing like veins under the skin of Briar Hollow. "They built tunnels," Mrs. Harper whispered, "deep underground. Some say they used them to move from place to place unseen, but others say it was more than that they were keeping something down there, something buried." Margaret leaned in closer, her fingers brushing over the faded lines. "What were they keeping?" Mrs. Harper glanced at her, eyes narrowing. "No one knows for sure. The records are vague, but there are stories of things that lived beneath the earth, things the old settlers tried to bury when they found the town. They thought if they sealed the wells, closed off the tunnels, it would be enough to keep them down there. But the wells are opening," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why now?" "That," Mrs. Harper said with a grim smile, "is the question, isn't it?" Margaret left the library with a deep sense of foreboding. The wells, the tunnels, the strange occurrences, they were all connected. But if something had been sealed beneath the earth, something powerful enough to warrant entire tunnels to contain it, What would happen now that the seals were breaking? That night, as the clock struck midnight, Margaret sat by her window again, staring at the ground as if expecting it to tremble. The bells didn't ring, the fog didn't come, but she felt it, a deep, thrumming vibration beneath her feet, faint, but unmistakable. The earth was waking, and whatever had been buried beneath Briar Hollow was starting to stir. The night after the wells were found uncovered, the town of Briar Hollow was cloaked in a tense stillness, as if every breath was being held in anticipation. The strange occurrences had left people on edge, and yet most of the townsfolk were reluctant to speak of them aloud. Fear festered in silence. Margaret Layton, however, could not sit idle. There was a sense of something coming, something inevitable, and she could feel it creeping closer with each passing night. It started at 3:33 a.m., the witching hour. Margaret woke with a jolt, her heart pounding in her chest, though she didn't know why. She sat up, listening. The house was still, the only sound the faint creak of old wood settling. But outside, beyond the walls of her home, there was movement. A distant rustling, like wind through trees, except there was no wind. The air was still and thick, unnaturally quiet. And then she heard it, carried faintly on the breeze, chanting. Margaret stood, pulling on her coat over her nightgown, and moved to the window. The night outside was dark, the moon barely a sliver in the sky. But in the woods just beyond the edge of town, she saw it. Glimmers of light flickering through the trees. Lanterns, torches moving in the darkness. The chanting was clearer now, low and rhythmic, an eerie hum that seemed to vibrate through the air. She knew she shouldn't go out there. Every instinct told her to stay inside, to lock the door and wait for morning. But something pulled her toward the woods, a deep, gnawing curiosity that outweighed her fear. She grabbed a flashlight and slipped quietly out the back door, making her way down the empty streets toward the edge of town. As she neared the woods, the chanting grew louder, the lights brighter. Margaret slowed her steps, moving carefully between the trees, staying hidden in the shadows. The closer she got, the more she could make out the figures moving ahead. Hooded figures draped in dark robes that billowed as they walked, their faces obscured by shadows. They moved in a slow, deliberate procession, carrying flickering lanterns that cast eerie shapes across the trees. There were more of them than Margaret had expected, at least a dozen, maybe more, gathering in a clearing just ahead. She crouched behind a thick oak, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The scene before her was surreal, like something out of an ancient ritual. In the center of the clearing stood a large stone altar, covered in moss and vines, as if it had been there for centuries, hidden away. The hooded figures surrounded it, their voices rising and falling in a strange, guttural language that Margaret couldn't understand. As she watched, one of the figures stepped forward, raising their arms toward the sky. The chanting stopped, and the clearing fell into an oppressive silence, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves overhead. The figure's voice, low and rasping, echoed through the trees. "We gather beneath the watchful moon to fulfill the pact," the figure intoned, their voice heavy with ritual. "The time has come. The hour is near." Margaret's heart raced. A pact? What were they talking about? She strained to hear, inching closer. "The seals are breaking," the figure continued. "The earth awakens beneath us. We must complete the circle as it was promised, or all shall fall to the darkness below." Margaret's blood ran cold. The wells, the tunnels, the things stirring beneath the earth. This was no ordinary gathering. It was a ritual, one tied to the ancient history of Briar Hollow, to the secrets buried beneath the town. She had to warn someone, had to. A twig snapped beneath her foot. The sound, sharp in the silence, seemed to echo through the trees. Margaret froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, every hooded figure turned toward her, their faces still hidden in shadow, but their eyes, dark and hollow, fixed on her with an unnatural intensity. For a long, dreadful moment, no one moved. Margaret felt her pulse pounding in her ears, her legs locked in place as the figure stared at her, unmoving. And then, all at once, they turned away, their focus shifting back to the altar as though she wasn't there. The chanting resumed, louder now, faster, the air humming with an energy that seemed to pulse through the ground itself. Margaret stumbled backward, heart racing before turning and running blindly through the trees. She didn't stop until she reached her home, slamming the door behind her and locking it with trembling hands. Whatever they were doing in the woods, it wasn't over. The gathering was just the beginning. And now, she had seen too much. Margaret couldn't shake the image of the hooded figures gathered in the woods. Their dark shapes burned into her mind like shadows that refused to fade. The air in Briar Hollow had become dense with dread, each night seeming longer than the last, the bell tolling louder, the hours vanishing more frequently. The whole town felt like it was teetering on the edge of something terrible, something ancient and inevitable. All Hallows' Eve approached, and with it, a sense of finality that weighed heavy on the town. The whispers of a curse, of a pact made long ago, echoed in every corner. People spoke in hushed tones at the general store, at the post office, anywhere they gathered. Fear clung to their words like fog. That night, Margaret sat at her window, waiting. She had barely slept since she'd witnessed the ritual in the woods, her mind racing with what she had heard. The seals are breaking, they had said. What was sealed, and why? And more urgently, what was coming now that the seals had begun to crack? The clock struck midnight, and the bells rang out, each chime deeper, heavier than the last. It was as though the sound was coming from beneath the earth now, reverberating through the bones of the town itself. Margaret shivered, her breath fogging the glass as she stared out into the night. Then came the fog. Thicker than ever before, it rolled in from the woods, enveloping the streets in an eerie, impenetrable mist. Margaret could barely make out the shapes of the houses across the road. The street lamps flickered and went out, one by one, until only darkness remained. The only sound was the faint hum of the bell, still tolling somewhere far away. And then, at precisely 3:33 a.m., the clock froze again. The world around her held its breath, as if caught between two moments, waiting. The ground trembled. Margaret's heart leapt in her chest as she felt it, a low, rumbling vibration that seemed to come from deep beneath her feet. She rushed to the window, pressing her hands against the cold glass. Outside, the fog shifted and twisted, and for a moment she could see them again. The dark figures, moving through the mist, their hoods pulled low over their faces. But this time, there were more of them. Dozens, maybe hundreds, converging on the town square, their lanterns flickering dimly through the haze. Something was happening. She threw on her coat and rushed out the door, the chill of the night biting at her skin. She knew it wasn't safe, but something was pulling her. Some deep instinct that told her she needed to be there, to witness whatever was coming. As she made her way toward the square, the fog thickened, swirling around her legs, tugging at her clothes like unseen hands. When she reached the center of town, she stopped cold. The altar was there, just as it had been in the woods, but now it stood in the heart of Briar Hollow, surrounded by the hooded figures. They moved in a slow, deliberate circle around it, their chanting rising and falling in rhythm with the tolling of the bell. The earth beneath the altar cracked, fissures spreading like veins, and from those cracks came a faint red glow. Something was pushing its way to the surface. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she watched. This was it. The curse. The pact. Whatever dark secret had been buried beneath Briar Hollow for centuries. It was breaking free. Suddenly, one of the figures broke from the circle and turned toward her. Though the hood concealed their face, Margaret could feel their gaze on her, cold and piercing. The figure raised a hand, beckoning her forward. "No," she whispered, her legs trembling. But something compelled her to move, to step closer to see what was coming. The ground shook violently, the cracks widening as the bell tolled louder, faster now, each chime ringing in her ears like a death knell. And then, from the heart of the altar, a shape began to rise. A mass of darkness, formless and ancient, clawing its way out of the earth. It towered over the square, its presence suffocating, the very air around it thick with malevolence. The chanting grew louder, desperate, as the hooded figures threw their hands toward the sky, their voices melding into one chaotic, frenzied cry. Margaret stumbled backward, her heart racing. She knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that the thing rising from the ground had been bound here for a reason. The pact, the rituals, they had been desperate attempts to keep it imprisoned. But now it was free. As the first tendrils of shadow reached out from the altar, spreading through the town like ink in water, Margaret ran. Behind her, the chanting stopped, replaced by a deep, resonant growl that shook the very earth beneath her feet. Briar Hollow was falling.